This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.
A conversation with one of Israel's finest and funniest writers, Etgar Keret. He speaks about his Holocaust survivor parents as we mark Holocaust Memorial Day, and much else, including the unfolding drama of Israeli politics. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the News from Keshet podcast. There is so much to talk about this week, Jonathan. But before we get to all of that and our special conversation with a very special man, Etgar Keret, I want to bring up something, which is a list that I know has been circulating for years, but somehow it surfaced again. A friend sent this to me, and it's online, and it's this this list that I wish I had when we started this podcast 2 years ago. It's a table, actually, and it says, what British say, what the British mean, and what foreigners understand. I would call this list the Friedlandish English Dictionary. So, for example, it will make it really easier for me to give this example. When Jonathan says, I hear what you say, what Jonathan means is, I disagree and I do not want to discuss it further. What Yonit hears is, he accepts my point of view.
I know.
And this goes on and on. This goes on and on. But it's so accurate. It's painfully accurate, I have to say.
I do feel seen, Yonit. By this thing. It is fantastic.
It's deciphering.
I know, it is like a codebreaker thing, isn't it? What Brits say with the greatest respect, what they actually mean, this is stupid. And what the foreigner thinks they mean is, oh good, he's listening to me. And you're right, I think we could put this on the Unholy website.
I have a favorite one. Which is, incidentally, by the way, when the British say this, they mean the primary purpose of my discussion is, what I hear is, it's not very important. This is lovely. There's another.
It's bad, this, because when I first saw this, I thought, no, come on, that's a stereotype. They're just this is a caricature of British people. And then I did look at it and thought, you know what? In a way, this is sort of how we talk, and it's almost impossible to avoid it. I don't know how to train myself out of it, but you're right. We could rebadge it as Jonathan and Yonit, because it is actually uncomfortably close to the truth. So there's this one, what Brits say, I'm sure it's my fault. What they really mean, it's your fault.
Yes, that sounds familiar to me. I have to admit that I have a friend, an Israeli friend who's been living in London for about 20 years, Eleanor, and she once said to me something that sort of clicked with me. She said, the day I realized that when the British say lovely, it doesn't always mean like it's a good thing, then I understood everything. I was like, that makes so much sense. You say lovely when something is good. You say lovely when something freaks you out and you don't know how to relate to it. You say lovely when something is not really great, but you don't want to insult anyone else. Like, you use lovely like we would use beseder. I mean, really, that is,
Yes, that's probably right. I mean, anyway, Yonit, you must.
And lovely of you to say that.
So charming of you to say that. You must come to dinner. The foreigner thinks, oh, they want me to come to dinner. The British person means, do not come to dinner. This is not an invitation. I'm just being polite. It's very, very problematic, this, because now when I actually genuinely say things to you, you're going to get the dictionary back. You're going to look up in the phrase book and go, oh my God, he's saying the opposite. It's often true, but it's not always true. And so the trick,
that's the fun of our conversation,
you learn over years of knowing someone, is which one is which. But it's not that easy.
I'm actually enjoying you calling me the foreigner, so I'm good. I'm good with this.
We're all good. So, Yonit, I think it would be lovely, incidentally, not the main purpose of the call at all, for us to talk about what's going on in Israel at the moment, by the way.
Indeed. I agree completely. And I really do, because when Israelis say something, they really, at least that right? They will tell you the truth to your face. So I completely agree with you this time, Jonathan. So that Oscar, leading the Oscar nominations, that film called Everything Everywhere All at Once? That is kind of what it feels like in Israel these days. Like the whole country is on overdrive. We've been talking a lot about the judicial overhaul or the judicial revolution. So the coalition at this moment, we should say, is completely undeterred by all of the protests and the criticisms. The objective is to run through the first reading of the Justice Reform Bill by the end of February. Absolutely no amendments. And then second and third reading by the beginning of April, which means that this will turn into a law by the end of the session of the Knesset, the beginning of April, really a whirlwind of legislation. That is the timeline when it comes to what Netanyahu plans and Levine plans. Now, the main thing that happened this week is, of course, that the economic pressure is mounting. You hear Netanyahu finally reacting to a lot of the protests because they're coming from the financial sector. A few things happened this week, beginning with Tuesday. Prime Minister Netanyahu meets with the governor of Israel's Central Bank, Professor Amir Yaron, of course, an appointee of Netanyahu himself, waving the red flag, saying, listen, sir, there are senior global economic figures that have expressed concerns about the potential consequences of this plan, lowering Israel's credit rating. To that, you add explicit forecasts made by the international credit agencies, including S&P, that the moves might lead them to cut Israel's rating. Maybe the most important thing that happened is 270 economists, leading economists in Israel, writing a letter and warning of the grave damage to the country's economy. And that really led Netanyahu to actually respond, because he couldn't have let this kind of sit without any sort of response.
So just explain why there's a connection, because the protesters out on the streets are saying this is terrible for Israel's democracy. They're saying this will endanger the rights of minorities who historically have been protected by the court. All bad things, but they wouldn't immediately say that's bad for the country's bottom line, that it's going to affect its kind of, economic output. So, explain the connection as the dissenting economists or these credit agencies around the world. What is it they actually fear will happen if this politically bad thing happens? Why does it have an economic impact?
So that's an important question. I'll use the words of Jacob Frenkel, Professor Jacob Frenkel, who is the head of Israel's central bank. And he said, I look at countries like Turkey, and I look at countries like Hungary, and what I see is that everywhere the judicial system is weakened, the economic performance weakened. That is the tie. And he's the economist, so he knows what he's talking about. I think specifically in Israel, the main concern, Jonathan, is the economy is not built on a stable, age-old industry or natural resources. The main thing our economy is built on is the high-tech sector, and that is a very fluid kind of industry, right? If Israel is less attractive for investors because whatever is happening in the streets, because you can't protect property rights, because the courts aren't independent, then they'll take their money elsewhere. This is why Netanyahu, he didn't react to other protests, but he did react to this one, calling for a pretty urgent press op and saying, no, we'll make actually democracy stronger and we'll make the economy stronger. By the way, he had no economist with him on stage when he said that, only politicians. And he kept saying again and again, I will do this with a wide agreement. He said that to the Israeli public. He said it also to Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, Biden's national security advisor. That kind of that line from Princess Bride leapt up on me. Like, you keep saying that word, maybe it doesn't mean what you think it means when you say wide agreement, but that is what he keeps promising. It doesn't look that way in the Knesset. That's we should say for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I have wondered throughout all of this whether this will be one of those things where all of the opposition sort of marches up to the top of the hill, only in the end for, the battle to be postponed or somehow fudged, and they march back down again. And the precedent I've got in my mind a bit is the drama about Israel annexing the West Bank and occupied territories and making a huge legal leap forward and saying these are no longer occupied territories, they are just part of sovereign Israel, annexation. Everybody thought it was coming, and in the end it didn't happen. Now we know it didn't happen because it was a quid pro quo bargain brokered through Donald Trump's administration that eventuated in the Abraham Accord. So in return for not going ahead with annexation, a peace deal with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and so on. And I have wondered if this will be one of those things again, where with perhaps the involvement of big economic figures or the United States, in the end, Bibi backs down, but he gets a big prize for doing it. I don't know what that prize might be. I mean, he wants a peace accord with Saudi Arabia. Does America somehow help that in return for not doing this thing? It would be unusual because it's a domestic change. It's not something in the, national security sphere or in the, international relations sphere as annexation would have been. But I just wonder if this is one of those things again where Bibi says, he's holding a big stick and says, I'm going to do it. And if you want me not to do it, you're going to have to give me something in return. I don't know.
I wonder what he wants.
Yeah, what does he want? I mean,
let's think. He's standing in trial for 3 corruption cases. I wonder what he wants, Jonathan.
Oh, I see. I mean, yes, but in terms of the people who can give him that,
of course.
I was thinking internationally, who they can't give him that. That's not something in the gift of the Biden administration.
But honestly, I don't know how he walks this back, even if, the pressure is mounting from all kinds of areas, either it's the United States or economists or international economists. Like, how does he walk his back when his base wants this plan? And we explained, I think, quite extensively last week, what is the logic of the side that supports this reform or overhaul, rather. It's going to be very difficult after he promised this specifically again and again in recent weeks to walk it back, even if he wants to. And right now, it doesn't look like he wants to.
Yeah. And meanwhile, we should keep an eye, I suppose, on this question of the Attorney General and whether or not they're going to slap a verdict of unfit for ministerial and prime ministerial office on Benjamin Netanyahu. That also is a sort of piece of this puzzle. We're going to look in the coming weeks more at this economic pressure. That is, to me, a new piece of the puzzle, the idea that this isn't just lefty protesters. This is now about the economic health of the country. And we know as a former finance minister, Bibi really thinks that's part of his brand, that the country does well economically. He won't want to be jeopardizing that. So maybe, but as fascinating what you say, is there a way to walk back? As this episode drops Friday, it is Holocaust Memorial Day, Holocaust Remembrance Day, as it's termed in other places all around the world, marking the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And that's the day internationally where people think about and talk about the Holocaust. We thought we would come at this at a sort of different angle, partly by just talking to somebody who's got a whole lot of things to say about a whole lot of things, but as also an expression that is used among Jews sometimes. He comes from the Holocaust, in a way, in terms of his family story. But why don't you introduce our guest, Yonit?
This is Etgar Keret about himself in his own words. It's fair to say I'm an anxious person. It's fair to say a lot of other things about me too, that I'm not relaxed and I'm a bit of a coward, that I'm slightly paranoid, although anxious is a more polite word, and we're not here to hurl insults. This is from his newsletter. Etgar Keret is a superstar of the Israeli literary scene, writer, filmmaker, internationally published author. His work has been translated into over 4 languages. His stories are sad and funny and absurd and unforgettable. His exhibition about his mother, called Inside Out, is being presented now in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. We'll hear his stories about her, his thoughts about art, but in this country it's pretty impossible not to start with politics. So Etgar, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, Yonit's right, really. It's the fate of any writer in Israel, I think, that every time they speak to anybody, the first question is always, so what about the political scene? Forget the stories you've written, the books you've written. What about the news? With the politics going on now, that it does feel very intense. What's your view of it? What do you think of these protests that have been filling the streets? What's happening, do you think?
Well, I want to say that, I really love the time when they would need a writer or an artist to interpret reality because it was so complex and ambiguous. But this really isn't the situation. I mean, a 5-year-old kid who had seen Star Wars, would know who he should root for. The moment where basically all the economists, lawyers, friends of Israel in the US and the world, doctors, professors, students, Nobel Prize winners, they're all saying this thing is not helpful and it will jeopardize the Israeli democracy. And basically the 2 people who are rooting for it is a guy who was indicted 3 times, in criminal offenses, and a person who's standing to a trial, and they're all talking about how they need urgently to change the judicial system. By the way, the judicial system in Israel have many problems, but one of its biggest problem is the fact that the processes are very, very slow. But the reform would not affect that. It would just mean that the prime minister would affect or elect the judges that will try him, but it would not make processes any quicker. So I'm saying it's really like Netanyahu and me, we were never on the same camp, but there were times where, you'd need to have some sweat to argue with him. But I think that now we're living in such a partisan reality, very much so like in the US or in the UK when it comes to Brexit, that the decisions became so tribal and religious that as an intellectual, you feel that you don't really have a lot to give. You can wear the colors of your team, but nobody needs you to interpret reality because reality kind of hits you smack in the face.
But you do have writers. I mean, Jonathan mentioned the protests and the literary giant David Grossman, who's talking in the protests last Saturday. You write about politics. It's not hard to guess where your heart is, but you don't do that kind of thing. You don't talk in front of a crowd and sort of rally the troops. Why is that?
No, because I think, as a writer, I think that my forte or my power is really to take something that seems to be simple and to show it as more complex and ambiguous. And I think that when you stand on a stage and you really need to incite people and to make them believe in a greater idea, it takes a different kind of talent. You really need to take something complex and present it as simple. And I'm saying, I don't think that all the people who can do one thing can do the other. David may be able to do both. But with me, I usually think that my role in society is that when a gang of people are running in one direction, I'm the guy who's saying, let's wait for a moment. Let's think. Do we really need to go there? So I don't really think that I'm a great power in giving speeches in demonstrations, but I attended practically all of them. And that's because the writers have a flexible working hours.
So, I mean, first of all, I'm struck by your Star Wars thing, because I can see who's Darth Vader in the story you've sketched for us, but I'm not seeing the Luke Skywalker or the Obi-Wan Kenobi. I mean, I know there are villains in this story, but are there any heroes that you can see?
No, and it's really, really funny because at one of the demonstrations, when Shira wanted to make a sign, she had an idea for a sign that kind of had to present kind of the two camps. And it was very easy to put Netanyahu or Deri or Levin on one side. But when she came to look for a face representing basically her point of view, it was, I think, in the end, the closest it came to was Winnie the Pooh. Because the thing is that really, I think that in Hebrew tradition, we have this thing that is called Geulah derech habivim, redemption through the
salvation
sewers.
through the gutters. Salvation through the gutters is how you would,
Salvation through the gutters. And I wrote in my Facebook that basically for so long, I really felt that I had so little in common with most of the political representative in Israel. People like Gantz, Matan Kahana, or Gideon Sa'ar. It doesn't matter what I think about them personally. We don't share the same opinions when it comes to refugees. We don't share the same opinions when it comes to the two-state solutions. We don't share opinions about anything. But it seems that, when somebody kind of puts us on the floor in the middle of the street and start kicking us in the head, we all agree that this is not right. And the idea is that you have a demonstration that you can have chief of staffs on the one hand and, vegan potheads on the other, and they're all there together. It's basically that they have one thing in common. They really don't want to live in a fascist country where they don't have any way to protect themselves, where many people are kind of a second level people, where Palestinians have no rights whatsoever. They don't want that. But I think that this is a very kind of weak meeting point. It's not as if we want to build the third temple, as some of the people in our government want to, but we just want people to stop kind of messing with the life that we were able to build here. And to be honest, when I go to demonstrations, I don't carry a sign, because when I go to those demonstrations, they look like the Disneyland of demonstrations of Israel through the ages. It's like I'm going down memory lane. I see people holding signs that they still had from the social protests, or people holding signs for the two-state solution, or holding signs for something. And it just kind of brings out how different the people in this camp are. And I really, really feel that, that it's weird that we had reached this point where people have to speak in bad English and state things that are obvious, that it's not good that a government will appoint the judges who will have to agree if what they're doing is right or wrong, that the Supreme Court system is mostly protects the weak people in the democracy, and that the nature of democracy is not that the majority will rape the minority, but that we will be able to coexist together. Now, so I'm saying it's really like, I'm sorry for being vain, but sometimes I feel I'm overqualified, to explain that. We just need a kindergarten teacher to say that. And, and the fact that we need a Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner to explain that in an interview really just says something. And I'm not talking about right and left, about how dumb our society in general had become, how basically we exchanged information and arguments for emotions. Basically, what you really see here, and I'm saying, I saw it also from the liberal side, is that to be a politician really means how you can get even from the people on the other side. And, and I followed the Brexit thing, and I couldn't help thinking that one of the main reasons for the people who supported Brexit was that all those kind of intellectuals that goes to France and drink wine and speak bullshit will stop smiling. This was one of the goals of doing it. And really in Israel, when we live in a society where I think that, in different periods, both the settlers and the ultra-Orthodox felt marginalized, felt attacked by the rest of the Israeli society, they really think it's kind of a payback day. When the ultra-Orthodox offer a law in which every person who has a dog will be fined in a set sum every year because ultra-Orthodox don't have dogs, and this is a way to get even, you really understand that it's really sometimes when you have a bad marriage or a bad relationship, then your partner or you ask the other person for something that you don't really need, but you just want to frustrate them. You just want, to embarrass them in front of their parents. And this is the dynamics that we're having. And I'm going to say really something very extreme, but in Israel, we all say we have different opinions, but we're the same people and stuff like that. But when I look at the entire world, after the social media, most of the countries, they're really split in the middle. It could be US, UK, Turkey, Israel. And basically what happened is that your friends are on Facebook, and the people that you hate the most live across the street. It's not the old days where French people would make jokes about British people that they get drunk at 4 p.m. and British people will be appalled how all the French people have lovers and they never had ones. We don't have any characteristic of societies. The people who are pro-vaccination or anti-vaccinations are all over the place, living in the same neighborhood and basically trying to kill each other. It's almost as if we need to cantonize countries. We need to find some kind of a libertarian solutions that will come instead of this idea of countries, because basically it doesn't work. When I look at Aryeh Deri, and I'm saying he's a super intelligent guy, he speaks very well. Everything he says is basically that he wouldn't want me to exist. He wouldn't want me to live or to do anything. So it doesn't matter. It's like, we can live in a reality where one side will oppress the other, or that we'll be oppressed. But I'm really, really doubtful that there will be this moment where we all think together. Those of us that believe that Jews are better than others, and those of us who really don't know how we came to this place.
But the interesting thing about what you're saying, Etgar, is that you kind of think like the whole world is becoming crazy. Like it's not only our problem; it's a global problem.
Yeah, it is a global problem. And I think that, that usually what happens in Israel is kind of like a petri dish, that if you stir at it, you can see what's going to happen 10 years later somewhere else. Before September 11, I used to go on tours in the US and say, oh, one day you'll have terrorist attack on your ground, and people say, oh, come on. And it did happen. We're not that special. We're just on steroids. We're just doing everything quicker.
We had Tom Friedman of the New York Times on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he said that the relationship between Israel and America is the relationship between off-Broadway and Broadway. That Israel tries things out and, has them first, and then eventually they go to Broadway. You'll get it a few years later. With your 9/11 example, it's a bit like that.
I would say that maybe Israel is the canary and the US is the miner holding our cage, It's basically because we don't even have the resilience or the economical backbone or the history of a country to survive things that the US can, because, it's a two-way street, because when you look at Trump and you look at what happened with the people storming the Capitol and saying that, that Trump had actually won the election, basically, I can easily see something like this happening here if Netanyahu would have lost. But I'm saying he's basically doing the same from a position of power. It's this idea that, that if it's a democracy that doesn't give me complete control, what kind of a democracy would that be, And I'm saying that we're also standing in a very weird situation where you have a government saying one thing and a prime minister say, don't take them seriously. Don't worry. They're just talking. I promised them, but I'm lying. This guy said that I'm a liar, a son of a liar. So don't really, he's just saying he's the minister of something, but who cares? I just bullshitted with him. So it's really, really like, it's a dynamic of a soap borderline with a sitcom. And I want to say, that when I see the coverage of it, in TV, there is this feeling that, this idea that we shouldn't take a stand. We shouldn't take a stand, which is something that happens in world media for so long. We can show a clip, in which you see a soldier beating up a peace activist, and they bring two people to the studio who say that he's not beating him up, and that they're actually making love, and that the peace activist started it all, and just so there will be some balance. But the idea is that for me, the communication is not somebody who's really trying to make peace in a fight between two sides. It's really those people who should state the fact and stand for these facts.
You're talking about another channel, I'm sure. You're just
no, of course. No, I'm saying, you're in a channel where your political analyst said in the most crazy evening when they burned the synagogue, he said that that we should make sure that the people who burned the synagogues will count their dead. So I'm saying that the idea where the news is basically kind of chewing the information and spitting it in our face as some kind of an emotion. Now you should be appalled. Now you should be surprised. Now you should do this, or now you should do that. It's really, it creates some kind of a reality where it's easier for people who are not democratic to control community, because the job of, when they say about the journalism being the watchdog of democracy, then really, in Israel at least, it's the puppy of democracy. It's really it doesn't even bark, it just rolls over and wants to be liked by everyone.
Okay, so we know, but we can get dragged into a conversation about Israeli media. I do want to pull you back into talking about the junction between politics and art, because if I look at what you've been doing in recent years, so there's this exhibition about your mother in Berlin. We're going to talk about that in greater detail later in our conversation. There's a series for Arte. There's a movie in Japanese and a short film for a Polish production company. Is this a conscientious decision to sort of pull away a little bit in your art from Israel?
No, I was born in Israel, lived here all my life. My parents were Holocaust survivors who saw great importance in Israel. It wasn't kind of just a random choice or one that made, it was an ideological one. And all my life, I lived in Israel and basically wrote about Israel, and I still write and publish books here. But whenever I need to do something that needs funding, I find it problematic to get the money here. The last series I wrote with a friend, which was about a rabbi adopting a Palestinian child that his family was murdered in a hate crime, is currently being developed by Netflix Poland. And it's about a Catholic priest taking care of a Chechnyan immigrant because I couldn't produce it in Israel. And now I don't think that, I'm being blacklisted, for my opinions or anything. I do think that we're living in a global environment in which have switched, from art to entertainment, and that basically with Netflix algorithms and with broadcast channels really wanting to control the content, then this idea of somebody coming with all kinds of ambiguous and strange ideas who really don't give a clear message that you should be nice to weaker parts of the community, or that women should be presidents. The moment that somebody says something that you say, is that good? Is that bad? Then a broadcasting channel, especially in Israel, would say, we don't want to mess with that. Maybe people will misunderstand what you're saying. And in this kind of reality, I'm hustling to do whatever I want to do. Whenever I want to do something, I try until I find a nice German/French/Japanese person who says, I find it interesting, but this is only after I ran out of Israelis to pitch this to.
So are you saying that it's those other societies, not Israel, that are more open to ambiguity, and that Israel wants it to be black or white, sort of morally clear one way or the other?
I would say that ambiguity now is a global taboo, but that when you go to bigger places, then, sometimes you have other chances to deal with that. But what I think is that we live in a very, very strange time where people basically want to control everything. When you have road rage, they want to control the way that other people will drive. They want to control what they're going to learn. They want to control the fact if you will vaccinate or not vaccinate, and in this kind of reality, people want to control the content that they're going to watch. The moment that my best friend's son watches Netflix series in double speed, and he complains about some series that they're not good because you can't watch them in double speed, so he doesn't watch them, then the moment that this is the bar that is being set, then of course, if I write something that is a little bit comedy, but it's sad in the end, and there is a sci-fi bit to it, then the Netflix algorithm says, we want our customer to be happy, and you're confusing them. And I really feel that, the way that the romantic way that I saw art was that basically, the foundations are our life, our reality, the way we function. And there is something about art that it's kind of a cloud hovering above it. But right now people are treating art as if art is the foundation and we're going to build reality on it. If we'll have women representation in Netflix series, then of course people are going to be nice to women and allow them to have an abortion if they want to. But it doesn't work this way. It's a little bit like that you have faulty airplanes and you're fighting for the fact that they won't show movies about exploding airplanes on the airplanes. Now, I don't care, show me an exploding airplane on the airplane, but just get the pilot to let me safely, and this idea is that art has really a practical function. I had an argument with somebody I truly appreciate that they told me about kind of blacklisting artists, that basically it's an economical act. It's like, let's say, if I want to go and see a Woody Allen movie, I'm punishing him. He won't put money into his pocket. Then I thought to myself, the moment that you say that money is more important than art, because I'm getting something and giving money in exchange. And the moment that you say, don't give him your money, you basically say, it's really not worth it. You're in a position of power. Money, you can buy a hamburger with it. But this guy, he just talks about his emotion. Who cares? Let's find a nice guy who talks about his emotion. Now, throughout history, I would say that, artists were basically perverts with license, not to live their life as perverts, but to think their life as perverts. And the idea that there was something there that people could approach and say, I got something in me, but I would never cut it loose, but thank you for naming it. Thank you for saying that I'm not alone. This was really the function of the artist. Now they want the artist to be the best student in class, the one with the best shave, the one who talks nicely. They want stand-up comedian to do that. Now it's really, really strange. I can say to you, look, I'm very short. And I used to be fat. And the reason that I'm not fat now is basically just because I'm depressed. When I have good mood, I become fat. I'm happy about it. Now, as a short and fat person, I would say to you that, if I would want to set Yonit with a guy and she'd ask me how he's like, I would say he's short and fat, but he's super smart and stuff like that, because I think it's relevant. The fact that I won't say it, if Yonit will go to a date and see somebody who's short and fat, it will have an effect on her. So why can't I represent that in reality? And on the other hand, sorry for giving this kind of crazy speech. On the other hand, I want to say that we invent new words and introduce them to the language, not to clarify situation, but just to make them more obscure. Yeah. And I said to Yonit once, I really don't need the anchorman to chew the news for me. Yeah. If somebody murders his family, I know he's not nice. I don't need people to say that.
I agree.
Let's get on to your latest piece of work, just because there's so much to talk about with this, and I really want to hear you on this subject, which is this exhibition of yours called Inside Out, which is about your mother. And again, it's an example of taking your work abroad. It's at the Jewish Museum in Berlin. I think the best way to get a sense of what you've done here is to hear some of it, because it's built around some stories about her, some very, very short, some long. Suitably for us, we can play a couple of short ones. And I just think it will give a little flavour of what it is you're doing. This maybe it doesn't need any introduction. This very first one about your mother and the business she ran. So let's hear this.
Fabric. Before I was born, my mother worked at an advertising firm in Tel Aviv. It was a demanding job, and she wanted to devote as much time as possible to her kids. So when I was a baby, she quit her job and opened a fabric store on a little street in our town of Ramat Gan. Fabric basement was on a basement floor with no windows, and it looked a bit like a musty cellar. But everything inside the store was decorated in good taste. Mom used to take me with her to work every day, put me on the counter in a bassinet, and there I spent my hours listening to her stern pronouncements on questions of cleavage and rivets, and inquisitively watching the eager women who entered the dimly lit basement to search for the perfect fabric and cut for the dress of their dreams. Mom liked to say that because of all those hours I spent in the store, I learned how to pay compliments to older women long before I learned how to walk. I remember my mother hoisting heavy rolls of fabric around in that narrow, dank space. It was hard work and not very rewarding, but when I was little, the fabric basement seemed to me like a sort of secret kingdom where my mother reigned supreme. Her subject came to her with their hopes and dreams, and she, the Queen Mother, proclaimed which options made them look thinner and which fatter, what was flattering and what looked cheap. She spoke with no hesitation or excessive politeness, just as a queen should. And the women kept coming to that little side street in Ramat Gan from all over the country, so that my mother could flip through the stacks of Burda magazines piled neatly on the counter and select the patterns that would accentuate their advantages and conceal everything else. Not everyone can be beautiful, Mom told me once. But if you make an effort and you don't give up, you can always be less ugly.
I mean, just hearing that, it goes to the point you were saying about ambiguity, because you come out of that story thinking your mother's a lovely woman and also quite a tough woman all at once. And even in just a few lines, you're conveying a wholeness about her, and all the stories do that. But you have said, I think, elsewhere that it took you a long time to write about her, and you found it difficult to write about her. And yet when you hear a story like that, you think, well, she's an absolute natural for as a subject for a writer. So why was it difficult?
Well, I think my mother was a very complex person, and she was also the closest person to me in my life, and the person that I loved like no other person. And whenever I would speak to people about her, it would seem like, I like to compare my mother to God. I know that it's, but that she has many faces, she can be merciful and vengeful, and humble and vain. And every person I met would kind of try to sum her up as something else. And I think that there was something about my mom after surviving the Holocaust, after losing her entire family, that she rebelled against any attempt to sum her up. We lived in a city or town called Ramat Gan, and whenever they would have some kind of a Holocaust memorial, they would always ask my mother to speak, because it's a city where most of the people are from Iraqi descent, so they didn't have many Holocaust survivors. And my mother always refused. And one day I asked my mom, why do you refuse? And she said, son, I don't work in the Holocaust, which is like, she knew that it wasn't grammatical, but for her, like, the Holocaust was this kind of big conglomerate, and they wanted her to wear the uniform and be a Holocaust survivor. And for her, I think that, as a child, she avoided having a number tattooed to her hand, but being seen as, in a reductive sense, as a Holocaust survivor, people feeling sorry for her having to take part in a certain narrative, seemed to her that it's as if the Nazis had branded her. They limited the space that she created. And for me, it was a great challenge, basically, to be able to tell her story without pigeonholing her in any of those holes, a Holocaust survivor, a nice person, a tough person. She was all of this, and I know that the stories that I can say can never be complete, but I thought that if there would be enough of them, and if there would be enough artists in giving their own interpretation to how they see this conduct, then maybe it could bring some of the complexities that she had in reality.
I have a very good friend who went through a creative writing class with you. She loved it. But one of the things she told me was that you teach a lot about writing as therapeutic. And I wonder if writing about your mother, and this seems to be someone with a very big personality, did that help you go through the grief of saying goodbye to her? Was that part of deciding to write now?
Yes, for sure. There is a funny thing that working on this project, I suffered from a herniated disc. And when I went to the doctor in Berlin, I said to him, I didn't lift anything. And he looked at me and he said, yes, but dead moms can be very heavy too. And for me, there was this moment that when I went to the opening of the ceremony, and I wasn't shaved. And my mother, all her life, she really, she was a true anarchist, and she would let us do whatever we wanted to. But she always insisted that when I go on stage on events, I'll shave, because she said, this is simply disrespectful. It's not aesthetic or anything. It just means that you don't care about the people. And whenever I would do an event that I knew would be on YouTube, I would always shave because I didn't want to mess with my mom. And when we opened the exhibition, I found myself unconsciously coming there not shaved. And when I tried to figure out to myself why it happened, and I thought to myself, this is a way of noting to myself that I'm not doing it for her memory. I'm doing it for myself. I'm doing it seeking some kind of closure, trying to give a name to something that I don't have a name. And for me, this is always the artistic process. The artistic process is basically dealing with the things that bothers you the most, and then hoping that it will interest other people too. But this is the order in which it works.
I want us to hear another second story. This one is in a restaurant. Let's hear this one.
A good day. When I was a kid, I absolutely loved eating at restaurants. It's not that I was some kind of foodie. It's just that in those days, in socialist Israel of the 1970s, going out for dinner was such a rare and decadent event that it was impossible not to get excited about it. Once every few months, we drive to Victor's place, a Tel Aviv eatery located next to a junkyard. After dinner, while Mom and Dad sipped Turkish coffee and smoked a cigarette, my brother would take my sister and me on an exhilarating tour of the junkyard, which we called the car cemetery. We'd stop at each crumpled vehicle and try to guess how it had ended up there. Trampled by an elephant, shot out of a cannon, or just driven too quickly and rammed into a stoplight. One Saturday, when I was about 6, we went to Victor's place for my mother's and sister's birthday, since they were born on the same date. The mustachioed waiter wiped the table with a damp cloth and informed us apologetically that due to a kitchen malfunction, the restaurant would not be serving fries. The rest of the family received this news somewhat indifferently, but I took it really hard. Instead of a big pile of delicious greasy fries, the waiter put a dish of white rice on the table. And within seconds, the lavish feast I'd been looking forward to for weeks turned into just another family dinner. My mother, sensing my frustration, asked me if everything was all right. Nothing was all right, I snapped. If I couldn't have fries, the whole meal was a waste of time. And this birthday, which was supposed to be fun, was now the worst day of my life. Mom listened patiently to my vitriolic complaints, and when I was done, she put the back of her warm hand on my nap and asked me in a half-whisper to tell her how many people were sitting in the restaurant. Being a good boy, I methodically counted them all. Saturday afternoon was one of the busiest time of week at Victor's, and other than our table, there were 26 diners. 26? My mom exclaimed with a whistle. That's a lot. Now could you please tell me what all those people are holding in their hands? Oh, come on, I said with a grin. That's easy. It's a restaurant. They're holding knives and forks. Mom was impressed. 26 people. 26 hungry humans sitting at their tables, each eating only what's on their own plate. 26 people holding knives, and yet not a single one of them is stabbing anyone else. She leaned over, planted a soft kiss on my forehead, and said, "Let's agree that this is actually a pretty good day."
This story had such an impact on me immediately, and I realized why, which is it reminds me of something else, which also had a huge impact on me when I first came across it, which is the opening of Art Spiegelman's Mouse graphic novel, which the very opening thing is between the son and the father, who is a Holocaust survivor. And the son is complaining about his friends being mean to him. And the father says to him, when you're locked in a cellar underground for starving, then you know what friends are. As if your experience and what you're complaining about, little child, is nothing compared to what I have seen. And there's something of that I felt in that story. You know, you paint this very rounded picture of your mother through these stories, but I did wonder if there was some of that you felt everything that you were living and going through, even as an adult maybe, just was nothing compared to what parents who are Holocaust survivors have seen.
Well, I think that the strongest vibe I got from my parents was that reality was very fluid. That they sat in restaurants like the one we're sitting in now, and then, you know, a couple of years later, they were sent to ghettos or put on trains and moved to camps. And the idea is that my parents always taught me to think about where things can go to, not only the obvious scenario, you know. So I mean, I remember as a child that I always had this anxiety, and until this day, I hate buying things. Because whenever I buy something and, you know, and I give the money note, I say to myself, what would happen if the guy would just put it in the cashier and say, please pay me. No, you didn't pay me, you know? And this is a thought that goes with me since I was 5, because I think 5 years old, because I think that my parents saw a social order crumble into dust, and the potential of that was always with me. So I think in this sense, when I was a child, I always had this kind of thought that if there would be another Holocaust, I would not have the ability to deal with it. I would never survive. I would never have the motivation or the power. I wouldn't be merciless the way that you need to be. I wouldn't be murderous the way that you need to be. And that I'm going to live until the next Holocaust will come, and then probably, we'll need to check out. And this was something that I felt very, very strongly as a child, that my parents had something in them that I didn't have. I didn't inherit this surviving skill.
It's interesting to me when you talk about your mother, she named you Etgar. In Hebrew, that means challenge. That's
Yes.
quite a thing to carry. I mean, did she ever tell you why, or is it like, how does that?
Yeah, whenever I give speaking of engagements overseas, I always say that my name, Etgar Keret, actually means literally urban challenge, which is a great name for a pair of sneakers, but a very weird name for a human being. And the story behind it is that I have an older brother and sister, and my mother wanted to have as many children as she could, but she wasn't very healthy, and also she wasn't very young, and she had 4 consecutive miscarriages. Mm-hmm. And when she got pregnant with me, she understood that it was her only chance to have another child. But I got jaundice in the embryo, and the embryo cord was tied around my neck. So the doctor said to her that I'm going to die anyway. And they wanted basically to take me out in pieces, not to endanger her. But she insisted on having me. I was born in 6 months in a cesarean operation. I had the jaundice and I weighed 920 grams. And the doctor said to her that I'm going to die in a few weeks. So the first thing that happened when they brought me to her, she said to me, they don't know what they're talking about. I'm going to call you challenge, and it will be your challenge to stay alive and to show them that they don't know anything about medicine. And I was named Challenge, and not only I stayed alive to make fun of them, but also when I had my Brit, she invited the doctor who told her that I won't survive. And according to the family myth, I beat him. I beat his toe during my Brit Milah, and he had to put a bandage on it. It's really like, my mother would say it in such great passion. She said it was like a bulldog locking his jaws, and he was trying to get you off his finger, but you insisted. And you told him, I'm alive, I will always be alive. My mother would kind of tell it with a lot of pathos. And the doctor ran away, but I stayed with the name forever.
I mean, I come away with this feeling that she put quite a lot on you one way or another. I mean, even the name we've talked about, but we're not going to hear it. But this story where your mother says to you, almost as a bedtime story, she describes to you an episode in which a neighbor was basically beaten to death in front of other people. It's, even that story has a lot of ambiguity in it, but she tells it to you when you're a very young child, as a bedtime story. You say somewhere else that your parents hadn't seen their own parents raise them because of the early deaths of their parents, and therefore they didn't really know how to bring up children. But do you think, when you look back, that she did put too much on you too young?
I think that in the end you're kind of the sum of your history, and when you're in a certain moment you can say, I'm okay with what I am, or I wish I was Jonathan, or the Incredible Hulk, or I don't know, Aryeh Deri. But so I can say that I'm content with who I am, and I think that that I became this person through the love that I got and through the scars that I had. I often say that I wasn't raised in a family, but I was raised in a loving group of partisans hiding in the forests of Ramat Gan, and I think that this was the sensation. And I remember that one of the things that me and my mother discussed more than once was the fact that I told her that I think that even if I'll be in an urgent situation, even if I need to save somebody, that I'm not sure that I'd be able to kill somebody. And my mother, to reassure me, would always say to me, "Oh, you would know when the moment will come." And she said, your brother, I don't know, but you, I'm sure you're gonna cut people throat. You're gonna murder them in a second. Don't worry. All this hesitation, the moment that anything will be in danger, you're a killer. I can see that you're a killer. Don't worry, And, and I'm a guy, I'm vegetarian since the age of 5, after watching Bambi. And when you're 6 or 7 years old, and your mother assures you that if you ever need that, you strangle somebody to death or kick his head off, then it's both kind of reassuring, but it's also scary because you say, maybe she knows better. Maybe I am a killer and I just think that I'm a liberal left-winger, I just want to explode and, I don't know, be like Thanos and murder everybody on this planet.
But it is interesting because your family, we should say, your 2 siblings, one of them is your older brother who's a left-wing activist, very active. And on the other hand, your sister who's is a settler. I mean, she lived in a settlement. Now she lives in Mea Shearim. She's an ultra-Orthodox. How does that all work together, even if we add, discuss what we discussed at the beginning of our conversation and this?
Well, so my parents, again, being Holocaust survivors, then my father's point of view said, is that it doesn't matter what your political ideas are. It just matters to him what reality you're aiming for. So it's basically for him, the political parties are just tactics. The question is, what's the strategy? And he always said, when I look at your left-wing brother, or my parents themselves were right-wing. They never voted for Netanyahu, but they were like Begin kind of people. When I vote for Begin, when you make your choices, when your sister prays, we all want the same thing. We don't want to oppress anyone. We want things to be better. He said it's a little bit as if like you have a table and you want to get it out of the room. And your sister says, let's pray for God to take out the table. And your brother says, let's take it through the window. And I said, let's take it through the door. We all want the same thing. We all want to live in a fair society. And that's why these political opinions don't create our identity, which is the reverse of what's happening in social media, in Israel, and in the world. The idea is that the moment yesterday I had my last class in university and I invited all my students home, and my favorite student and the best one that I had in many, many years, and probably one of the kindest people that I met, he lives in Hebron, in Drom Har Hebron. I don't know how you say it in English, but it's basically the most hardcore settlement, the place that ideologically, I think that it's the last place where Israelis and Jews should be. But I can acknowledge that and acknowledge in the same time that he's a human being who has doubts and who's basically kind and who keeps doing good and tries to become a better person. And there is no contradiction between the two. And I think that now we live in this kind of a binary unlike reality in which this is not considered right. It's really like, I talked to him and he said to me, some people in the university, the moment that they hear where I live, they stop speaking and they walk away in the middle of a sentence and ignore me. And I really think that one thing that it's good for the liberal camp to remember in these days is basically to try and think whichever unpleasant experience that we're having as citizens now, to try and think of something that is close to or similar to what people on the other side had felt. Let's say the fact that I don't want a person to bring some misogynic or homophobic things inside my son's high school curriculum. Really, the closest I could get to is the fact that we want a ultra-Orthodox institute to teach math in the English, or they won't get support. I'm not saying it's the same, because I really understand that, if they learn English and math, they would be able to integrate in society, and it's good for everybody. But I can empathize with the fact that somebody goes to your children's school and tells them, what you've been teaching is not good. I want you to teach that. The violence of that act is something that it's easier for me to feel when it's being done to me. And I'm saying that it's a little bit like we're having this football game where each has its own team, but we should be aware of the fact that there's no rules anymore. that the fact that, if somebody hits me with a hammer and I hit him with a hammer, I may score a goal, but we're losing our game.
Yoni mentioned David Grossman before, and he has this thing where he says if he had to describe who he is and in the order of what's most important, and I hope I'm remembering this right, but I think he would say that he was Jewish, male, Israeli, in that order. That in terms of understanding him, the most important fact about him is that he's Jewish, second, that he's a man, third, that he's Israeli. But it was interesting to me, the order. It may have been male, Jewish, Israeli, but the important point was that Jewish came before Israel. And the New York Times wrote about this. It said that Keret, about you, it said Keret might be classified more as a Jewish than an Israeli writer. And it said more versed and interested in the varieties of alienation, working in the tradition of Franz Kafka, Sholem Aleichem, or Isaac Bashevis Singer. I don't know what your answer to the Grossman question would be, which order you'd put those three things, if those would be the three important things. But is there some truth in that about you being a more Jewish voice than an Israeli voice, do you think?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't know where to put the male thing, I probably just put it somewhere on the shelf, but I'm definitely, I would see myself Jewish before I see myself as Israeli, because again, as my mom would say, the Nazis had decided that for us. It's really like the idea is that I can immigrate from Israel, but apparently I can't stop being Jewish, and my heritage comes from that. The history of my family is not from Israel. It's from various diasporas, from Poland or from Belarus. And also, I think that there is something, to be honest, I don't feel very strongly attached to national identities. I know it's not a nice thing to say, but basically I feel that I'm kind of a diaspora Jew in the sense that if you put me in a room with 5 people, I will already feel a minority. I'm most likely to disagree with most of them and to feel oppressed by the others, So I think that for me, being Jewish is really this idea that when I studied in elementary school, I said to myself, wow, we Jews, we would argue with anybody, even with God, look at all our heroes, Abraham, Job, Jonah, God said to them, go and do that. And they say, oh, no, we don't. You don't know anything about this word, God. And I think that this idea is that, in Judaism, you learn in chevruta, in pairs, because you learn through polemic and through argument. All those things are things that define me, For me, Israel is first and foremost a place. It's a bunch of people. It's a language. It's a dynamic of society that I feel attached to much more than a flag or some kind of a big speech that keeps you at awe.
Yeah, I'm quite surprised none of us said that we should start with neurotic, Jewish, and then the rest. But okay.
That kind of Jewish is
kind of implied. It's implied. It's implied.
Yes, it's implied.
I'm too neurotic to be a male.
Exactly. I have to. I can't end this without quoting our sound editor Omer, who's your biggest fan really in the world. And he asked me I told him we were going to talk to you. He said, Etgar is so modest, but he knows he's a genius, right? So I'm throwing that to you.
Well, I'm not modest and I don't think I'm a genius, so I think he got them both wrong, but I'm so happy that he likes my writing.
So we should remind our listeners that your exhibit Inside Out in the Jewish Museum in Berlin will run until March 19th. It's very successful, so it's been extended until March 19th. We really thank you so much for talking to us, Etgar. You made us smarter. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Etgar.
The recordings of Etgar's stories that you heard are courtesy of This American Life. Ira Glass, the show's inimitable host, will also present these stories on stage with Etgar at the Jerusalem Festival in August. Every time you talk to Etgar, you have this feeling like, I wish I could go on with this conversation for another 3 hours, right? I mean, he is so, unique, original thinking. Half the time you're laughing, you think he's so smart. You have this moment where you're shocked by it's a whirlwind of a conversation. It's like getting on a roller coaster and not wanting to get off. I know you don't like roller coasters, but you know what I mean. Like, it's this experience to talk to him. It
really is. He's a complete one-off. He's such a sort of, you used the word that he's such an original. The reason why I love this latest batch of stories about his mother, from this exhibition is I really felt as if suddenly, okay, I now sort of get so much of why he thinks the way he does, how he thinks the way he does. And sometimes that can spoil it, like working out how a magician does the tricks kind of thing, but absolutely just deepens the experience of those stories that, that sometimes over the years they seem a bit random. They kind of, where does that come from? It begins somewhere, it goes somewhere. It doesn't have a complete, an obvious closure or ending. And all of that suddenly, to me, it just sort of clicks a bit with these stories about his mother and just the sense of her and the sense of him as her son. It sort of comes together, but as I say, it only adds to the pleasure of it all. And it was just a privilege and a joy to talk to him. And you're right, we had only scratched the surface. I mean, there was so much more. I wanted to ask about why he's giving away all this writing on his, he does a newsletter, but it's all just part of
this. This is for the next time we talk. It's funny, these people that you feel like they're taking you, like they're giving you their hand and they're walking you inside into the ocean, and you don't know if it's going to be fun or if you're going to drown, but you're following them, right? That is like that's a feeling that you get from him. So it was such a pleasure to talk to him. Tradition is tradition, my friend. That means that we need to give out awards.
We do. So I'm going to, why don't you begin with chutzpah, actually? Why do we do that? Because we'll save our mensch for the end.
So we're still talking a little bit about Israeli politics. I know we've been doing that a lot, but this is a new bill that a freshman lawmaker put forth. There's so many of these that you kind of need to put them in order, but this is one I wanted to bring for our chutzpah nominee. It's an amendment to the privacy law, updating the list of actions defined as violations of privacy, which means the proposals would add to the list publishing a recording of a person without their consent as something that includes sensitive information. It can only be done with the consent of the individual. It would make publishing recordings, which obviously is a basis for so many journalistic stories and exposés, obviously impossible. Why am I telling you all this? Because the bill is proposed by none other than newly minted Likud MK named Boaz Bismuth. That name means a lot inside Israel, maybe less outside. He is a former journalist. He was the editor of Israel Hayom. He was also a foreign affairs editor for many, many years. So this is a journalist, and his very first bill is submitted is something that would curb any sort of option for journalist exposés. I think it merits chutzpah.
That is proper chutzpah, almost in the very purest definition, because it's got that beautiful element of
the rich, sting in the end,
rank hypocrisy, which I think it's a sort of classic of the genre. So I'm rather approving of that. I think it's going to be a journalist of a rather different kind who wins our Mensch of the Week award. And for a few times we have awarded this posthumously, but this one particularly saddens me because it's my colleague on The Guardian, former colleague on The Guardian, who retired a few years ago, Ian Black, who died last weekend. He was the Middle East editor of The Guardian, among a whole variety of jobs, formerly a Jerusalem correspondent in the 80s and 90s, and he died at the youngish age of 69 last weekend. Really loved by many of his colleagues, and it fell to me actually to write the obituary of Ian in The Guardian, which was not a job I ever wanted to have to do. And I made the point in there, and this was quite true, that within minutes of hearing that Ian had died, some emails came into my inbox, but within minutes of each other was one from a Jew, profoundly connected to Israel, and then seconds or minutes later, one from a Palestinian analyst, sometime negotiator for the Palestinians. And I thought that is sort of Ian in a way, because he was somebody who was really respected and trusted by both sides in that conflict, which, look, we both know it takes some doing. It's quite hard to do that. And that people who didn't agree on much else did, say often to each other, look, when it comes to coverage of the Middle East, you could trust Ian Black. So we mourn his passing and acknowledge it by making him our Mensch of the Week.
Completely agreed. And I think it's a good opportunity to tell our listeners to go back and read, or read for the first time, his book called Enemies and Neighbors, which is one of, I think, the best, at least single volume accounts of Arabs, Jews, Palestine from 1917 to 2017, I think. It's just a wonderful, wonderful book. Good opportunity to read that or reread that. We're coming to the end of our conversation, Jonathan, so we should say our thank yous to Gaia Glaser, Omer Primat, Rom Atik, and Yair Bashan.
We do. We say thank you to all of them, and remember, all of you, if you're enjoying listening to Unholy and you haven't yet done a rating or review in all the obvious places wherever you get your podcast, please do that. It helps. It gets more people to be aware of the podcast and to listen to it. And you can also do that on our Facebook page, Unholy Podcast, same on Instagram. Generally, do pass it on. Till we speak again next week, Yonit.
We'll meet next week.
And you must come over for lunch. Really. Really. Why have we not set a date? I'll send you some dates.
I was waiting for that. A little bit more of the British dictionary.
I'll send you
Why
some
don't you
dates.
come over for lunch? I never want to see you again. We'll meet next week.
This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.